Hi guys, I'm Sarah, and this is episode 7 of the Barn Quilt Project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. I found this week's block north of Brentwood on Breezy Acres, a farm which produces eggs and meat, and the block on their barn is a chicken. I really love it when farms use what they produce as inspiration to create a barn quilt, like the strawberry block I did in episode 4. The chicken on this block is pink with orange feet and a red comb and is surrounded by a border of yellow, purple, and green. A lot of colors going on, but lucky for me, I have a lot of scraps that I can use for this project. The chicken also has an egg sitting in front of its feet, and I think that the best way to approach this is going to be to sew up the chicken block and then applique the egg on at the end. All the fabric that I'm using for this block is either thrifted or left over from another project, or both. The pink is actually thrifted, and I used it to sew a baby dress, and now I'm using the offcuts to make this chicken. I decided to start by cutting out all of the pieces I needed to piece this block together. Starting with the yellow, I cut out one 3-inch square, two 2 3/4 inch squares, one 2-inch square, and two 2-inch by 6.5-inch rectangles. From the red fabric, I cut out two 2 3/4 inch squares for the chicken's comb. Now the pink had the most pieces that needed to be cut out. I tried to use as many of the small scraps I had as possible while cutting out one 3-inch square, one 2-inch square, one 2-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle, one 2-inch by 3-inch rectangle, one 1-inch by 3-inch rectangle, one 1-inch by 2.5-inch rectangle, and two 4.5-inch by 5.5-inch rectangles. That's a lot of rectangles. Moving on to the orange chicken feet, I cut out one 4-inch by 2-inch rectangle and one 4-inch by 5.5-inch rectangle. For the green border at the bottom, which I think is supposed to represent grass, I cut out a 1.5-inch by 12.5-inch rectangle and a 1.5-inch by 11.5-inch rectangle. And finally, for the purple border at the top, I cut out one 1-inch by 11.5-inch rectangle and one 1-inch by 11-inch rectangle. With all the cutting out of the way, it was time to start assembly. I started by sewing up all of the half-square triangles I will need. I grabbed my 3-inch yellow square and 3-inch pink square and pinned those right sides together. Then I grabbed my two 2 3/4 inch red squares and two 2 3/4 inch yellow squares and pinned those right sides together. I drew a line diagonally across each pair of squares to use as a sewing guide. For the red and yellow squares, I sewed a 1/4 inch from either side of the drawn line. And for the pink and yellow, I sewed a 1/4 inch from only one side of the drawn line, since I will only need one half-square triangle for the beak. Then, I cut down my drawn guidelines to separate my half-square triangles, and gave them a good press. Then, I set them aside to use later. I decided to start my block by sewing up the feet. So I grabbed my orange pieces as well as my 2-inch pink square. I laid out my pieces and started by pinning the pink square to the short edge of the smaller orange rectangle. I sewed it up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and gave it a press. Then I pinned my larger orange rectangle onto the long edge of the pieces I just sewed together. I sewed up that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then took it over to the ironing board to give it a final press, and then the chicken feet are done. Next up is the chicken's head, so I grabbed the pink and yellow half-square triangle, trimmed down to 2.5 inches, for the beak, as well as all of the smaller pink pieces, and laid them out in order. I started by pinning the 1-inch by 2.5-inch rectangle to one of the pink edges of the half-square triangle. I sewed that up, and then I pinned the 1-inch by 3-inch pink rectangle to the other pink edge of the half-square triangle. I sewed that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then gave it a press to get it laying flat. Then I took the 2-inch by 3-inch pink rectangle and pinned it onto one of the yellow edges of the half square triangle. I sewed that seam up with a 1/4 inch allowance and gave it a press. Finally, I took the 2" by 4.5" pink rectangle and pinned it onto the edge of the piece that still has yellow from the half square triangle exposed. I sewed that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and gave it a final press, and my chicken's head was done. It does still need eyes, but I'm going to embroider those on at the end. Now it's time to put my chicken's body together. I grabbed my head, feet, and 2 remaining pink rectangles. I pinned the head to one of the pink rectangles and the feet to the other, making sure that everything is in the correct orientation so that I don't accidentally end up with a chicken with an upside down head. Nobody wants that. Then I sewed up my seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and took it over to the ironing board. When pressing, I kept in mind that I want the seams to nest in the next step, so I pressed both seams towards the pink. This way, when I sew them together, the seams will be pointing in opposite directions. I pinned the 2 pieces I just sewed together, nesting those seams and again making sure the head and feet are in the correct locations. I sewed that up, again with a 1/4 inch allowance, and gave my chicken body a good press. With the body fully sewn up, next I moved on to sewing up the comb. For this, I grabbed my yellow pieces and my red and yellow half square triangles, which I trimmed down to an even 2 inches. I arranged my pieces how they will appear in the final block and pinned them up as 2 strips, one with just the rectangle and half square triangles, and the other with the extra yellow square added onto the end. I sewed them up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and gave them a press. Fun fact about chicken combs: a chicken having a large red comb, like the one in the block, indicates that the hen is laying eggs. Perfect for an egg farm. Anyways, once the comb was sewn up, it was time to add it to the chicken. I started by pinning on the shorter strip, the one without the added yellow square, and sewed that seam up with a 1/4 inch allowance. Once that first side was sewn on, I pinned on the other. When I did this, I made sure to nest my seams where the top 2 half square triangles meet to ensure that I get a sharp corner. I took my chicken over to the sewing machine and sewed up the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I gave my chicken a press. With the comb added on, it's definitely looking a lot like a chicken. Now it was time to start adding on the border. I started by pinning on the shorter purple rectangle, which you can tell from the video I accidentally cut too short the first time, but don't worry, I fixed it before I had to unpick anything, and the measurements I gave you at the beginning are correct. I sewed up that seam and gave it a press, pressing the seam towards the purple. When I started this block, I didn't know if I would like the added border, but I really do. It gives the block a finished look. Next, I pinned on the longer purple rectangle on the other top edge, and in the same step, I grabbed the shorter green rectangle and pinned it onto the opposite edge. I then took it over to the sewing machine and sewed up both of those seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The green border fabric that I'm using is one that I thrifted in a mixed bag of quilting fabric, and I thought it would be perfect for this block because it has little purple and orange flowers to complement the top border as well as the chicken feet. Once those seams were pressed, it was time to pin on the final piece of the border. So I grabbed my long green rectangle and pinned it on to the final edge. As always, I sewed that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And with that, all of my piecing for this block was done, and I gave it a final press. Now to get this chicken and egg. I started the egg by first making a template out of paper. I folded the paper in half and drew on half of an egg shape in the size that I thought looked good. I cut it out and unfolded my template. Using the template as my guide, I traced the shape onto some plain white fabric and cut out 2 eggs. I decided to cut out 2 rather than 1 because I thought it would be easier to sew two together and then turn them, rather than iron over the edge of one to then applique it on. So I pinned those two eggs right sides together and took them over to the sewing machine to sew around the edges, leaving a small gap on one of the flatter edges unsewn. I cut little slits towards the seam on the more curved edges to help the seam lay properly, and turned the egg right side out. I massaged the seam into place a little bit and then pressed it flat, making sure to tuck the edges of the unsewn gap inwards. Once the egg was ready to go, I pinned it onto the chicken where I wanted it, and sewed close to the edge all the way around to secure it. This block has a lot of potential with this little egg. You could make it a fun quilted Easter egg, or you could make the block a wall hanging and have the egg be a cute little pocket. Next week's block isn't anything as creative as a chicken, but it is unique, as it is one of the few barn quilts that I've seen that has patterned pieces on it rather than just solid colors. So subscribe if you want to see how that translates into an actual quilt. Now that she has her egg, all this chicken needs is some eyes, and I chose to embroider these on using black embroidery floss. I drew the location and size I wanted the eyes, and then used the satin stitch to fill them in. I think this week's block turned out looking pretty cute, but is it just me, or the more you stare at it, the more the beak starts to look like a wide open smile instead? Anyways, I hope you liked this block too, and subscribe if you want to see more. Next week, we leave the egg farm behind and head to the flower and veggie farm, and their block is on theme. We'd love to see it. Happy quilting.